Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast. Today we're diving into something really fascinating, the book of Ecclesiastes. It's one of those texts that's been, pondered for centuries and for good reason. It grapples with some of life's biggest questions. What's the point of it all? What does it mean to live a good life?
You hit the nail on the head. What's so captivating about Ecclesiastes is that it doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. It comes from the perspective of someone who, on the surface, seemed to have it all: wisdom, wealth, power. Yet this person, who we call the preacher, still found himself wrestling with a deep sense of meaninglessness.
It's almost like he was looking at his life, a life most people would envy, and saying, wait a minute, is this all there is?
Exactly. And that's where this idea of vanity comes in. It's a word the preacher uses over and over again, almost like a refrain throughout the book.
Okay, so vanity, not in the sense of being obsessed with your looks, but
More like a sense of futility of things being fleeting and ultimately empty. Imagine the world as the preacher saw it: the sun rising and setting every day, generations coming and going, the wind blowing in circles. It's all part of this endless cycle that contributes to this feeling that nothing really lasts, nothing truly satisfies.
It makes you think about those times when you've worked so hard for something, finally achieved it, and then there's this letdown. Like, okay, what now?
That's the essence of what the preacher is getting at. He tried filling that void in every way imaginable. The book describes him building houses, planting vineyards, amassing wealth. He indulged in pleasures, surrounded himself with beauty, even dedicated himself to understanding wisdom.
So he wasn't just sitting around moping. He was actively trying to figure out what gives life meaning.
Absolutely. And what's so striking is that even after all that striving, all that experiencing, he still arrived at this conclusion: vanity of vanities, all is vanity.
It's almost like a warning, isn't it? Like he's saying, don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't waste your life chasing after things that won't ultimately fulfill you.
I think that's a really insightful way to put it. It's a cautionary tale, but it's also an invitation to look deeper, to question those things we often take for granted as the markers of a successful or meaningful life.
Speaking of looking deeper, one thing that really struck me was the preacher's complex view of wisdom. You'd think someone as wise as him would be totally content, but he actually points out some downsides to knowledge.
That's what makes Ecclesiastes so thought-provoking. It challenges our assumptions about the things we often value most, even something like wisdom. The preacher describes it as a double-edged sword.
I'm curious about that. How can wisdom be a bad thing?
It's not that wisdom itself is bad, but the preacher realized that the more you understand the world, the more you become aware of its complexities, its pain, its injustices. He says, in much wisdom is much grief. He who increases knowledge increases sorrow.
It's like the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know and how many problems are out there that you can't solve. It can feel overwhelming.
Exactly. Imagine being able to see the world with incredible clarity, understanding the interconnectedness of things, the consequences of actions, the suffering that exists. That kind of awareness can be a heavy burden to bear.
It's a good reminder that knowledge, while valuable, isn't the be-all and end-all. It needs to be paired with something else, maybe a sense of hope or a belief in something bigger than ourselves.
You're touching on something really important here. The preacher seems to be grappling with the idea that even wisdom has its limits. It can illuminate the world, but it can't necessarily shield us from its harsh realities, especially the ultimate reality of death.
That leads us to the big, often uncomfortable question. If everything is temporary, if we all end up facing death, then what's the point of anything? Does the preacher offer any kind of answer to that?
He does, and it's one that might surprise you. He doesn't sugarcoat the reality of death. In fact, he calls it the great equalizer.
In what sense?
He observes that death comes for everyone regardless of their status or achievements. Wise or foolish, rich or poor, we all end up in the same place.
It's like that saying, you can't take it with you.
Exactly. And that realization, while sobering, also leads the preacher to a profound question. If all the things we strive for in this life ultimately don't matter in the face of death, then how should we live? What truly gives life meaning?
Before we get to those big questions, I want to remind everyone to like and subscribe to the Allison Knows podcast on Spotify and YouTube. Now back to Ecclesiastes. Where does the preacher go from this realization that death is the great equalizer?
Well, it would be easy to fall into despair, wouldn't it? To think if it all ends anyway, why bother with anything? But surprisingly, the preacher doesn't take that route.
So what does he suggest? Does he have some secret formula for finding meaning in a seemingly meaningless world?
It's not so much a formula as a shift in perspective. While he acknowledges the fleeting nature of life under the sun, he also encourages us to embrace the simple joys that are available to us. He says, "Go, eat your food with gladness, and drink your wine with a joyful heart."
So it's not all doom and gloom. He's saying there's still room for pleasure, for enjoyment.
Absolutely. In fact, he sees these simple pleasures as gifts, things to be savored precisely because life is short.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. He's not telling us to ignore the harsh realities of life, but he's also urging us to appreciate the good things we have. It's like finding a balance between acknowledging the darkness and celebrating the light.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that balance is key to understanding the preacher's message. He's not advocating for mindless hedonism, but for a mindful appreciation of the present moment, even in the face of life's inevitable end.
Okay, so we've talked about vanity, wisdom, death, and even pleasure. But I have a feeling there's more to the preacher's message. Did he ultimately arrive at some grand conclusion about how to live a meaningful life?
He did, and it's a conclusion that brings all these seemingly disparate threads together. After all his searching, all his questioning, he arrives at this statement: "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man."
Fear God. That sounds
Uh-huh.
pretty intense.
Mm.
Is he talking about being terrified of some kind of divine punishment?
It's more nuanced than that. Remember, we're talking about a book that's been interpreted and reinterpreted for centuries, so fearing God has taken on different meanings over time. But in the context of Ecclesiastes, I think it points to something deeper.
Like what?
It's about recognizing a power and authority greater than ourselves. It's about understanding that there's a moral order to the universe, a set of principles that govern our actions and have consequences that extend beyond our immediate understanding.
So it's not about living in fear, but living with a sense of awe and respect for something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that our lives are part of a larger tapestry, a grand design that we may not fully comprehend, but that we can choose to align ourselves with.
It's almost like saying that even though life under the sun can feel meaningless, there's a deeper meaning that we can tap into by connecting with something beyond ourselves.
You're getting right to the heart of it. And this idea of fearing God offers a way to ground ourselves, to find a sense of purpose that transcends the fleeting nature of the material world.
This is making me think about all those times when I felt lost or directionless. Maybe what I was missing was that connection to something bigger, something to give my life a sense of meaning beyond just my own little bubble.
I think that's a very human experience, and Ecclesiastes speaks to that longing within us for something more, something that gives our lives weight and significance.
So how does this idea of fearing God play out practically? What does it mean to keep his commandments in a modern context?
That's a great question and one that's open to interpretation. But I think it boils down to living a life of integrity, kindness, and purpose. It's about making choices that are in alignment with our highest values, even when it's difficult.
It's like choosing to act from a place of love rather than fear, even when the world around us seems to be falling apart.
Beautifully put. And that's the challenge, isn't it? To live in a way that reflects that deeper meaning, that connection to something greater, even amidst the vanity that the preacher describes.
This is making me rethink the whole idea of success. It's not just about achieving worldly things, but about living in a way that's true to ourselves and to a higher purpose.
That's a powerful insight, and I think it speaks to the enduring relevance of Ecclesiastes. Even though it was written thousands of years ago, it still offers us a way to navigate the complexities of modern life and find a sense of meaning that transcends the fleeting and the superficial.
I want to pause here for a moment to remind our listeners to like, subscribe, and share this episode of the Allison Knows podcast with your friends. We're diving deep into some pretty profound stuff here, and it's always more fun to explore these big questions together. You can find us on Spotify and YouTube. Now, back to our deep dive into Ecclesiastes. We've talked about this idea of fearing God as a way to ground ourselves and find meaning. But earlier, we were also talking about the preacher's advice to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. How do those two ideas fit together? They seem almost contradictory.
That's the beauty of Ecclesiastes. It embraces paradox. The preacher isn't afraid to hold seemingly opposing ideas in tension. On one hand, he sees the world as full of vanity, of things that ultimately fade away. On the other hand, he urges us to savor the good things we have, to find joy in our work, our relationships, the simple pleasures of life.
So it's not about choosing one or the other, but about embracing both.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between acknowledging the limitations of the under the sun world and appreciating the gifts we've been given. It's about finding a balance between striving for meaning and enjoying the journey.
It's like being able to hold both joy and sorrow at the same time, to recognize the beauty of life, even in the midst of suffering.
You've captured it
Or
perfectly.
no.
And fearing God, in the sense we've been discussing, provides that grounding, that sense of perspective that allows us to do both. It helps us detach from the things that ultimately don't matter and focus on what truly does.
This is making me rethink my whole approach to life. It's not about denying the difficult things, but it's also not about getting bogged down by them. It's about finding that place of balance, of acceptance, of gratitude.
And that's where the preacher's wisdom shines through. He's not offering us a set of rigid rules, but a way of seeing the world that allows us to live more fully, more meaningfully, even amidst the challenges and uncertainties.
It's interesting to think about how these ideas from Ecclesiastes written thousands of years ago can still feel so relevant today. It's like the preacher had this um, uncanny ability to tap into the human condition, into those questions that we all grapple with no matter what time period we live in.
It's true. And one of the most powerful messages that emerges from Ecclesiastes is this idea that meaning isn't something we find out there in the world. It's not about achieving some arbitrary level of success or accumulating a certain amount of possessions. True meaning comes from within, from aligning ourselves with a purpose that transcends the fleeting nature of the material world.
That reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the idea of fearing God. Not in a sense of dread or punishment, but in a sense of awe and respect for something bigger than ourselves.
Hmm.
It's about grounding ourselves in something that gives our lives weight and significance.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we're part of something much larger than ourselves, something that connects us to a moral order that extends beyond our limited, under the sun perspective.
So it's not just about living for ourselves, but about recognizing our interconnectedness with the world around us and with something greater than ourselves. It's about living with a sense of responsibility, recognizing that our actions have consequences that ripple out beyond our immediate sphere of influence.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about understanding that we're not just isolated individuals pursuing our own selfish desires. We're part of a web of relationships, a community, a universe that's governed by something greater than ourselves. And that realization can be both humbling and empowering.
Humbling because it forces us to acknowledge our limitations, our place in the grand scheme of things.
Yes. And empowering because it connects us to a source of strength and purpose that transcends our own individual efforts. It's like tapping into a power source that gives us the energy and motivation to live a life that truly matters. A life that's not just about chasing after the wind, as the preacher puts it.
Okay, I'm starting to get a sense of the depth and complexity of the preacher's message. But there's one more thing I want to explore. He keeps talking about how everything eventually fades away, how even great accomplishments will be forgotten. If that's true, how can we find any lasting satisfaction in anything? It all just seems so temporary.
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? And it's one that the preacher grapples with throughout the book. He sees the world as it is, with all its beauty and its sorrow, its triumphs and its tragedies. And he recognizes that nothing in this under the sun realm is truly permanent.
So is he suggesting we just give up and say nothing matters?
Not at all. He's urging us to find a different kind of satisfaction, a meaning that doesn't depend on external validation or material possessions. It's about finding joy in the journey itself, in the simple pleasures of life, in the connections we make with others, in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding, and ultimately in aligning ourselves with something greater than ourselves.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's still hard to shake that feeling of, what's the point if it all eventually fades away?
I understand. It's a question that has haunted philosophers and theologians for centuries. But I think the preacher offers us a powerful perspective shift. He's not denying the reality of impermanence, but he's suggesting we focus on a different kind of legacy.
Not the kind that gets etched in stone or written in history books, but something more intangible.
Exactly. It's about the impact we have on others, the love we share, the kindness we offer, the moments of beauty we create. These things may not last forever in a material sense, but they ripple out into the world in ways we may never fully comprehend.
It's like throwing a pebble into a pond. The ripples continue long after the pebble has sunk to the bottom.
A perfect analogy. And that's the kind of legacy the preacher is encouraging us to cultivate. It's about living a life that leaves the world a little bit brighter, a little bit kinder, a little bit more full of love.
Wow, that's a powerful message. It's about finding a meaning that transcends our individual lives and connects us to something much larger.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our lives have a significance that extends beyond the under the sun perspective. And that realization can give us the strength and motivation to face the challenges of life with courage, hope, and even joy.
Well, folks, we've journeyed through the ups and downs, the wisdom and the weariness of the preacher's search for meaning. It's been a deep dive into a book that continues to challenge and inspire us thousands of years after it was written.
And we hope it sparks some new questions, some fresh perspectives, and maybe even a renewed sense of purpose in your own life. Remember, even in a world that often feels meaningless, we have the power to create meaning through our choices, our actions, and our relationships.
Thank you for listening to the Allison Knows podcast. Don't forget to follow Allison on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking that deeper meaning that lies beneath the surface of it all.